Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 20th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria, and I am just getting over COVID. I actually had COVID last week when I recorded the previous exercise episode, Slime with Suzanne Vedlik, and you could probably hear it in my voice pretty badly. I also had it when I recorded this episode and the next one that comes out, even though it was a short time. I happen to do a lot of podcast recordings. I'm on the tail end. I'm now testing negative. I just still have a little bit of the sniffles, and so I apologize if my voice is maybe a little bit deeper and a little bit different than usual, but that would be why. I got a great episode for you this week, but before I dive into it, I do want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I rely on the incredible support of listeners just like you. This week's top patrons include Danielle Lang, David J. E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, and so many more. Thank you all so much. And if you're interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. All right. So let's talk about this week's episode. I had the opportunity to chat with a fascinating woman. She is a science and kind of natural history writer. Tons of books and articles with specifically a focus on Australian nonfiction. And she's won a lot of awards as well. Her books have won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Nonfiction, the Federation of Australian Writers Award for Excellence in Nonfiction, a Whitley Award for Popular Zoology, and she's been shortlisted for the Children's Book Council of Australia and National Biography Awards, and longlisted for the NIB Literary Award. She's got a new book called Koala, A Natural History and an Uncertain Future. So yeah, we talk all about koalas today. Without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Danielle Clode. Well, Danielle, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for writing a new book. I'm excited to talk about it. You've actually written several books, though, or you've written several books on your own, and you've also had your writings featured in several books. And it looks like the age range is really kind of all over the place, from littles all the way up to books for adults.
Yeah, that's right. I mostly think of myself as writing for adults. I guess that's my core audience, but I've also written several books that turned out to be very popular with children. So I wrote a few more that were specifically for kids, and that's particularly in paleontology and fossils.
Love it. And so you yourself are a biologist. You are trained as a conservation biologist. How have you chosen across the board, like all of the different areas that you like to write about?
I guess I've always been a little bit interdisciplinary. So even though my doctorate is in biology and zoology and animal behavior and conservation, I did start out doing an arts degree. So I started out in psychology and doing animal behavior. So I've always had a really broad range of interests, and I think writing has really promoted that and enabled me just to follow whatever interests I have. So my books are all revolve around environmental themes, I guess, either scientists or natural history stories or particular animals or ecologies. But yeah, they are pretty broad ranging for sure.
And this, I may venture to say, I could be wrong, feels like it may be kind of your most specific of your writings, because you chose to focus in on one, maybe I shouldn't say species, maybe not, maybe one genus. I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, it is one species indeed.
Okay.
But at least in the modern era, there's been a lot of other species of koalas in the past, but the only one we have left is one particular species. And yeah, you're right. This is probably my most specific book in that sense. A lot, I've written a lot on bushfires and different scientific stories, museum collections, those sorts of things. So they've been a bit more wide ranging. And this one, I guess, is really coming back to the core of my training in a way, in that it is very much a behavioral and evolutionary study of an animal, and also looking at their conservation and what we need to do to keep them with us.
There's so much to dive into, from the sort of paleo evidence, or at least the historical evidence, all the way up to what's going on now and what the future holds. But I'm curious, and of course, anybody listening who hears your accent is like, okay, yeah, koalas, Australian. Okay, but is there a deeper connection there, other than the fact that obviously these animals and you share the same land? Is there anything particular that, drew you to wanting to write a full-length book about them?
Yeah, I guess koalas are such an iconic species. They are a poster child for conservation, not just in Australia but internationally, and particularly in the face of the recent bushfires that we've had over the last 10 or 20 years in particular. Koalas have really been at the forefront of that and the impact on koalas. And there's a huge level of human concern about koalas that extends way beyond what people normally care about in terms of the animal kingdom. So I think the Black Summer bushfires that we had along the east coast of Australia a few years ago now, were particularly telling in the way people responded to those fires. And they were the first bushfires I know of in my study of our history of fires, in fact, where wildlife was front and centre of people's concern, both in Australia and overseas. I've never known that to happen before. Usually people are purely concerned about the impact on people and the human peril. But in that one, koalas were really the forefront of that campaign and that concern, and there was just a massive anxiety and affection, I guess, for animals and the fate of koalas in the face of those fires. And I think that's one of the reasons I particularly wanted to look at them, because I guess as an Australian, I'd always taken them a little bit for granted. They're so well known, and yet you hardly ever see them. And it's easy to forget that they're real animals with complex lives and play an important part in the ecosystem. And they're not just a fluffy toy that you pop on the end of your bed or a children's story.
100%. And I think that knowing that, the core audience of this show, of Talk Nerdy, is mostly, I would say, in the English speaking world, just, by virtue of the fact that I'm an American podcaster, I'd say that probably the small majority is American listeners, but then we have listeners from the UK, from Australia, from South Africa, and then that follows with places where English is not the dominant language, yet English is a common language, because I do have listeners all over the world. And I'll say that as somebody who travels quite often, I probably have about the same, if not maybe slightly more information about koalas than like the typical American, only because I've seen some, I've been around some, I've gone to some conservation centers in Australia. That said, my knowledge is limited. So I'm gonna give you like my top 3 or 4 koala factoids, and you can just like skewer me for what I don't know or what I'm getting wrong here. So I know that they are not bears, even though everybody calls them koala bears. I think that they eat eucalyptus. Yes. Okay, good. They can carry chlamydia, which is fascinating to me. And I know that in Los Angeles at the LA Zoo several years ago, our famed mountain lion, which recently passed away, P22, did snack on a koala that they forgot to bring back into the enclosure because this specific koala doesn't like to sleep in trees. It likes to sleep on the ground. And so that was a nice news story for a while.
Wow.
But that's pretty much my koala
knowledge. I did not know about that one.
So yes, somewhere in the world at some point in time, 2 species, nary should they have mixed, American mountain lion and an Australian koala did engage in some tasty, meat swapping. So yeah, that was interesting. But beyond that, I know nothing. Please enlighten us.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's pretty accurate. You're absolutely right. They're not bears. although they've been called that for quite a long time. When Europeans first came to Australia, they called them monkeys, sloths, bears. I think the bear moniker really hooked in the 1930s, that kind of era when the children's toy industry really picked up, and the whole teddy bear craze kind of kicked in, and koalas make perfect teddy bears. They've really got the natural posture for it. I think they're probably quite a bit more cuddly than most bears.
I would think so. Yeah.
They at least don't try to eat you. So yeah, I guess that's where that comes from. Really, it's a children's toy moniker. But yeah, they're marsupials, so they have a pouch. So they're related to the great family of marsupials that dominates Australian mammal fauna, and is so distinctive and so very different from the rest of the world. So the kangaroos, the wombats, the possums, all of those sorts of animals all have pouches and are part of a great lineage that's quite distinct from the rest of the mammals. So that really sets them apart, along with a whole heap of other things. You're pretty spot on with everything you've said. Actually, they do indeed eat eucalyptus leaves. Yeah.
And they get chlamydia.
And they get chlamydia. That's correct too. Yes, they suffer terribly from chlamydia. So they've got a rather unfortunate host of sexually transmitted diseases, actually, which is causing them a great deal of difficulty at the moment.
So this is something that I've long been curious about, and I think there's a lot of things about the Australian sort of ecosystem that are quite unique. Australia, like America, really in this way, is like a huge island, yet it's not. It's very much surrounded on all sides by quite a bit of water. So there's all of the weird kind of evolutionary things that happened. Or that continue to happen in islands that have contributed to the unique kind of flora and fauna. But I'm super curious about marsupials in general. Are there things that you can point to that sort of confer evolutionary advantage to marsupials, or are there things that make them way more, I guess, sensitive or way more potentially negatively impacted by things like deforestation and climate change and disease?
Yeah, I think we probably just need to see marsupials as an alternative stream of evolution for mammals. They're not. I wouldn't say they're more or less adapted. Everything's adapted to the world they live in to a greater or lesser extent. Depending on the change that happens and the particular characteristics they have. So, we have hugely successful animals like kangaroos. There's a great many kangaroo species that are absolutely booming in numbers and are very successful if you take them overseas. And we have possums that also get established overseas. So there's nothing intrinsically vulnerable, I think. I guess the issue with Australia being, you're right, it is a big island, and because of its continental land mass, that means it can support a very high level of diversity, as large land masses can. However, it's also a big island and very much an island. It's the most isolated of the big land masses apart from Antarctica. Whereas America, for example, has had land bridges, both between North and South America, of course, and also with Europe. So the species there have been impacted by more invasions of different species. So I guess when you have a lot of contact with new species coming in, the tight, close little evolutionary relationships that evolve between species that are isolated together for a long time don't evolve. So you've just got a much more disrupted evolutionary system. And I think that's why Australia is characterized by quite a lot of strange, almost symbiotic relationships between species that perhaps get sort of mashed together a little bit in other places. So, we've got a really high level of mimicry, a massive amount of Cuckoos, for example, we're the heartland of different species of cuckoos and relationships with different species, mimicry between orchids and wasps, spider mimicry, those sorts of evolutionary partnerships, symbiotic relationships between ants and trees and butterflies. They're very complex and very highly evolved, and they can only really occur, I think, in a place that has not had many new species coming into it a lot. And I
right.
think
I'm curious, is that in and of itself, this very intricate, very protected evolutionary dance, is it in and of itself vulnerable against the modern impacts of the Anthropocene, of human intervention?
Yeah, I guess so. In that, it just because it's not that those impacts have just happened in the past in other countries, in other continents, where invasive species have effectively come and gone and moved between continents and had their impact, whereas islands tend to be isolated from those factors. So that's why I think Australia is particularly vulnerable to extinction of mammals and other groups. Is because it's both a large landmass with a high biodiversity and an island continent with a high vulnerability as a result, because those species have been isolated. So it's not that they're more vulnerable, it's just that they're facing impacts that other countries have already dealt with and their species have already gone extinct. So
that makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm especially curious about koalas as their own species, because I do think that there is and correct me if this is a complete sort of misunderstanding, but there's almost a stereotype, we could say, almost a bias that koalas are kind of slow and kind of stupid and not very adaptable and sort of just like out there just waiting to go extinct, which is a really sad stereotype, but I think it's one that a lot of people might hold.
I think we really like to blame species for their own
right.
Yeah. That's much more comfortable to us than to actually
blaming ourselves.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and it's also it is ultimately also it stems from a very Eurocentric view of the world. A very Western view of the world. When Europeans first went to America, they had very much the same reaction. They basically, famously, European scientists said that American fauna was degenerate.
Yep.
And lesser than European, and that's what would happen to humans if they went there. So there is that very Eurocentric bias, and Australian fauna has suffered from that as well. That marsupials are commonly pitched as being lesser than placental or eutherian mammals because they're less familiar. That's just because people don't know as much about them. They look different, so they can't be as good. And so there's a broad mythology that marsupials are stupid, less advanced, more primitive, all of these sorts of things. And koalas are, sort of sit at the apex of that.
They really do, don't they? Sadly,
which I do go through in my book and debunk a lot of that mythology around koalas, and a lot of it's it's tied to the trees they eat. So people will argue that koalas are slow and stupid because they eat eucalyptus leaves, which are toxic, and therefore they don't have enough energy to do anything else, and therefore their brains have shrunk. None of which is true or even makes sense if you think about it. So
right. And there are plenty of species on this planet that have a very specific diet that evolved, as you said, almost like symbiotically with a particular source of fuel. So I'm curious about, I don't know why, but it does capture the imagination, this cuddly little mammal on these trees that specifically eat this one leaf. I think we see something similar with pandas. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's the same story.
Yeah.
You've chosen badly in evolutionary terms, and therefore you're going to go extinct. We always say koalas only eat one thing. There are up to 900 species of eucalypts in Australia. They're the dominant tree in our forests. They're the major tree, and they are difficult to eat. So a lot of mammals struggle with eating them because the toxins in them make them feel sick. Koalas have managed to exploit those trees, that really vast forest estate. So they're really that's actually a really good move if you live in Australia. And not only that, but they've managed to adapt to a wide range of species. So koalas as a species are known to eat at least 70 species of eucalypts. Although individual koalas only eat between 3 and 10 different species of eucalypts, but that's still a pretty wide range. So we have this interesting thing, whereas as a species, they're actually generalists. But as individuals, they're specialists. So they specialize on particular trees that are found in the area that they grow up in. Now, obviously, there's no point in adapting to eating a tree that's found on the other side of the country.
Right.
So,
I was wondering, is that a function simply of what's available? Is it a function of culture, of what's been learned within the family? Like, this is good, do this because this is what mom and dad taught you?
yeah, it's a really interesting question. That it seems to be quite closely associated with what they physically can eat, because, like most herbivores, koalas can't actually digest the cellulose and lignin in their plant diet themselves. They have to have a microbiome to do that. But their microbiome is very specialized. So it appears to be adapted to the particular species of eucalypt that they eat. And they receive that microbiome from their mother. So they have to actually be inoculated with the bacteria they need to eat leaves. So little Joey koalas, when they're feeding on milk, they can't eat leaves at all. They'll mess around with them, but they don't eat them. So it's not until they receive that inoculation from their mother, in a very messy and slightly unpleasant method.
Can't wait to hear about this. Yes.
Yeah. So the koalas have they keep their gut. The majority of the bacteria, I suppose, is contained in a cecum, which in humans is the appendix, but we only have a residual cecum, which is about the size of our thumb, whereas koalas have one that's 1.5 meters long or so. So it's quite a lot larger, and that's like a pocket that holds a microbial soup. And the koalas chew up their leaves, wash the fine particulates into the cecum, and the bigger bits just get passed through, and they sit in that soup for days, for quite a long time, while they get digested, and then the nutrients are absorbed in that way. So that process is really specific. And when mothers need to wean their joeys, they actually evacuate the contents of the cecum. So it's not a normal fecal, dropping. It's a bright green soup that comes
Interesting.
out, and the joeys absolutely love it. And it's very messy and looks pretty disgusting.
But there's something in it that attracts them. There must be some sort of factor, some sort of
Yeah,
scent or something that
they
attracts the
absolutely
babies to it.
know that is what they need, and
Right.
they consume as much of that as they possibly can, and from then on they eat leaves.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. And so are they getting some of this microbiome in their breast milk, but then the vast majority has to come through this like cecum dump?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's looked at what biome comes through the breast milk.
I shouldn't say breast milk.
Yeah.
Is it breast milk? Wait,
I
do
don't know.
marsupials?
I'm not sure.
They're different kinds of mammals, right? I'm so confused.
Through lactation.
Yes.
Yeah. But definitely the pap feeding is really, really crucial to koalas, and they could certainly not survive. They wouldn't be able to consume or digest that food properly. So there's arguments that, we do this with captive animals. Zookeepers will be familiar with this process, that if herbivores are struggling in a zoo, young herbivores, they get diarrhea or whatever, it's very common for zookeepers to crush up fecal samples from a healthy adult, put it in their milk and feed it to them. And that's a way of inoculating them. And we do this with humans as well. So humans can also be inoculated with fecal samples. That's a standard medical practice. And interestingly, there are some people who seem to be extremely good sources or good donors for this. So they're the super poopers. And their samples are really prized by the hospitals for re-inoculating a human gut biomes with the right bacteria to enable people to be healthy. So I think increasingly we're learning how important that is, and it's really particularly important in koalas.
I'm curious. There's something, and I think, again, we think about pandas in this same way, which is funny because it's like, yeah, koala bears and panda bears. And like you said, they're at the foot of little kids' beds all over the world. But there's something about them going back to this stereotype, which absolutely is a very colonial, very kind of Eurocentric stereotype, that there's something almost tame about them. Like, they're clearly wild animals. They're not domesticates, but there's something that has long felt. And I think I worry a little bit actually about the imagery and the coverage of some of the wildfires playing into that, where you would see these struggling koalas and you'd see like a koala hand reaching out to a human hand, or like, grasping a human being as they're like taking it to safety. And it's like, oh no, we should not be hugging koalas.
Yeah, the koala hugging is a really interesting thing. And I think that part of it is, koalas have got some characteristics that really tap into some human emotions, and some of our instinctive behaviors correlate just purely through coincidence with koalas. So koalas have faces that we intrinsically react to as faces. We have special neurological receptors that makes us very susceptible to those particular shapes of faces. So the koalas sort of generate that kind of very maternal or paternal response to them with a childlike feet. They're quite childlike in size. The way they sit, the way they hold their arms up to their parents, and also young koalas, if they're approaching people, will very commonly put their arms up to either climb up you or to be picked up. So they solicit responses from humans. Not all the time. A lot of koalas will just try and move away from you and would prefer to keep their distance. But occasionally young koalas will come into contact with humans, or injured koalas, or koalas looking for assistance. And they don't have an intrinsic... They're not particularly flighty animals, I guess.
Right.
In their, they don't run away the way a lot of other animals do. And it's quite unusual for a wild animal, I think. If you imagine you're trying to rescue a cat or a dog from a place that it's stuck, they very rarely allow human assistance. They normally cause problems for you if you're trying to get them out of a tree or something.
Right, and they're domesticates.
And they're domestic animals that are accustomed to humans and used to seeking assistance from humans. Whereas koalas seem to react quite differently. They seem to be willing to accept assistance or even seek assistance from humans on occasion. That's not to say that we should necessarily go and inflict our company on them in every opportunity. Most of the time, they prefer to be on their own, but they do have a strange response to humans, and they're quite curious animals. They like to look at humans and keep an eye on them. So you always notice they're watching you from the top of the trees if you happen to be nearby. So they do present a difficulty for humans in knowing how to respond to them because they do have a way of interacting with us that's unusual.
Yeah, and of course, I think people in our way, we feel compassion, we feel empathy. We also have that like cute factor. And sadly, I think that, even under normal circumstances, not dire circumstances like during the wildfires, people are like, oh, cute thing, I want to pet it, which is not okay.
No, I mean we're primates and we like fiddling with things, and humans are quite unusual in being particularly interested in other species. We're very, very attracted to other species and wanting to touch them and pat them and interact with them far more than other species necessarily do. But koalas do approach other animals. They'll approach horses and kangaroos and all sorts of other species. So they do have interspecific interactions. So it's an unusual. I think they just happen to tap into a few key things that really hit our buttons and create that very emotional response to them.
Right, which I guess did work in their favor. I mean, sadly, in the grand scheme of things, not really, because when we talk about these horrific wildfires, I mean, we know in the heart of hearts, right, that our human activities are what's causing these problems. But at the same time, there was a really big rescue effort, was there not?
Oh, absolutely. There was koalas attract more funding than any other species, I'm told, in terms of conservation efforts. But the conservation efforts are largely directed at rescuing injured animals, which obviously is a very worthwhile thing to do. But we seem to be very keen on rescuing animals and not so keen on protecting them in the first place. And really we need to be devoting more effort to making sure those animals have the habitat they need to be safe and healthy, rather than having to rescue them when they run out of habitat and come into contact with cars or diseases or other factors that are impacting their well-being.
Right. And so let's sort of take a step back. Obviously, I want to talk about the future and the future of this species and kind of what we can be doing to help protect them. But also, let's look at their past, because I think a lot of people, we're sort of aware of like certain ancient animal species. We're aware of dinosaurs. We're aware of some of the great kind of larger mammal species that have gone extinct. But I don't know how common knowledge it is that there were kind of great koalas that in the fossil record, and B, this sort of interesting thing that again happens because of island ecology, where you either get really big things or really, really small things.
Yeah. I mean, koalas are really interesting. I've because as I mentioned earlier, I've written quite a few books for kids about Australia's fossil history and megafauna. And I guess one of the things that always interested me is when we look for pictures of fossil koalas, they always just look like modern koalas.
Oh, cool.
They were just funny. A little bit bigger, which is not a very exciting picture, to be able to present. Oh, it's a koala. And I thought, well, how do we even know what those koalas look like? Because the only things we have to go by are largely their teeth. Because Australia has quite a poor fossil record because it's such an old continent, and we've had a lot of erosion, so we don't have a good fossil record. In the way of having whole skeletons and things like that. So we tend to just have the teeth, which are the hardest bit. Teeth last longer than anything else, which fortunately are very, very distinctive. So they're easy to identify if it's a koala or not. But it doesn't tell you much more about it other than a rough indication of size. So you've got a big one or a small one, but you don't know if it had the same types of climbing adaptations, if it had the big fluffy ears, if it had the big black nose, did it have a tail? Were ancient koalas like possums, or were they more like wombats? We really don't know because we haven't got the full skeletons of the prehistoric animals. So until those skeletons come to light, we're not really going to know the details about prehistoric koalas. All we do know is the type of food they ate. So we know that they ate leaves rather than grass, and we know that they changed in the toughness of the leaves they ate. So modern koalas seem to be adapted to the particularly tough leaves of the eucalypts, whereas some of the prehistoric koalas were probably eating softer rainforest leaves. And it may well be some particular adaptation to eucalypts that have enabled the modern koala to survive where some of their prehistoric cousins did not.
I'm curious, we are using the word prehistoric and really talking about the fossil record. How old were they? Like, do we know when they first came on the scene?
Yeah, interestingly, they're about 25 million years old is the oldest record of koalas, and that's around the same time that eucalypts first started to appear on the Australian continent as well in the fossil record. So that's quite interesting. Possibly there are earlier koalas, but we haven't found them yet. So they have been around for quite a long time, and I guess, we did have a range of different ones, and in the megafaunal period, there was also a giant koala, which wasn't a giant in terms of, as big as a bear or a big bear, but it was still about 3 times the size of a modern koala, so a pretty hefty beast for sure. So about 30 kilos.
What was sort of the milieu at the time? Like, what were koalas hanging out with? Do we know what other animals existed alongside them?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, the megafauna of Australia is quite interesting because, when we think about megafaunal species, we tend to think about, woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and giant sloths and stuff like that. But of course, they're mostly placental mammals, eutherian mammals. So we had giant marsupials instead. So we had animals that are quite different from anything that currently exists, and the close cousins of the koala are quite interesting because they include Diprotodon, which was the biggest marsupial megafauna. So that was a 2 to 3 ton animal. So like a big grazing wombat or bear, if you like, that sort of size animal, about the size of a small 4-wheel drive car, if you like. So, but it had a pouch and it carried its young in a pouch. So we know we have fossil diprotodons actually that still have the joey being carried in the mother's pouch, and we know it didn't. The joey wasn't walking because the foot bones are not mature. So it was carrying those young animals in the pouch. So there are all sorts of strange animals. There's Thylacoleo, which was a giant predatory. I guess we could call it a predatory possum. So it was like a possum-like animal, but it was probably more like a leopard. So ambush predator in trees, had an astonishing killing bite. Just incredibly strong jaws and big slicing blades for teeth in the back of its mouth that slice through meat, and a retractable thumb claw for grabbing hold of its prey. So that koala that met with the mountain lion might have had some sort of residual genetic memory of Thylacoleo leaping on it.
It's amazing. Yeah. I always think about this when we look at the way that we sort of describe a lot of these ancient species. And I'm like, man, it was a rough time. Like, there's a jungle out there, like literally.
Yeah, there was also Megalania, which was the other big predator, which was like it's a relative of Komodo dragon, only about 5 meters long. So pretty enormous giant lizard that was really, you wouldn't want to meet with that one either.
It's so curious to me. I wonder if koalas back in the day, ancient koalas still had a very similar temperament. If they're like, ooh, what are you? And it's like, ooh, bad idea.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a reason they stayed up in the trees. That's a nice, safe place to be relatively. And I think being tree dwellers is actually explains a lot about their personality or their temperament in their lack of flight response, because their defense mechanism against predators is to sit tight in a tree, and they are actually very hard to see in trees. I had one just in my yard. I knew it was in the tree, but it took me forever to find it because they're so that they just curl up in the crook of a branch and don't, unless they move, they're very hard to spot. So that's their best defense mechanism, and that keeps them pretty safe from most predators. There's a powerful owl which occasionally takes koalas, but pythons might occasionally up in the tropics, but really until they come down on the ground, they're pretty safe from most predators.
And what are their typical predators on the ground?
Well, historically it's been dingoes, which are the native Australian dog. And now dogs generally form a really big threat to koalas. So dogs are a big problem for them. There's a lot of dog attacks, and cars are obviously a huge impact as well, because they do cross roads, and they don't run away from cars either. It's a real characteristic of koalas that it's not uncommon for them to sit in the middle of the road when a car comes across them and just wait. Which is not a great reaction in the middle of a busy road.
So clearly we've got, human impact. Dogs are domesticates, people letting them outside, letting them off leash, or feral dogs that are running around. We're talking cars, roads, crisscrossing their habitat. We're talking anthropogenic climate change, as we saw, there's so many aspects of that, from the wildfires to, habitat loss. We are their biggest threats, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, the habitat loss is a really big factor, I think, for koalas. We have lost an awful lot of our forest estate in Australia, and even the forest estate we have, we're continuing to change it through native logging in the eastern states. So Queensland and New South Wales still have logging of native forests, and that actually reduces the number of edible gum trees and increases the level of toxic gum trees. So there's quite a lot of gum trees that koalas can't eat at all. So even though it looks like a forest, it's not an edible forest anymore. So those factors play a big role, and it has even bigger impacts on, of course, the other species in the forest as well. We also tend to like living in the same habitat as koalas. So we like, the lush river bank areas of forests, and those are also the key forest areas that are best for koalas, because the more water the trees get, the less toxic they are and the more nutritious they are. So breeding koalas in particular they're walking a fairly fine line with their food to be able to have enough nutrition to raise a joey to adulthood. It takes a long time to raise a joey because of the low nutrient leaves they eat. And so, if you reduce that nutrition further with the trees and remove the ones along the rivers and the creek lines, then you make it even harder. So again, it's not just the existence of forest, it's got to be the right forest. A koala needs a very big area of forest to support it. Most koalas have an average home range of about the size of a sports field of forest. So, and in poorer forest areas, more arid areas, that can be as big as Central Park. So that's one koala per Central Park. So they're very dispersed animals, and they need a lot of different trees because they can't just keep eating the same tree. It's not like that. It's very characteristic of koalas. When you offer them leaves, they maybe have been eating the same leaf for quite a few weeks, perfectly happily off the one tree, and then suddenly they'll decide they won't eat it anymore. And we don't know why that is, but it's quite likely that the toxicity levels have changed. The balance has changed in the leaf, and it's no longer palatable to them. So they need something else. And you have to, in zoos, you have to provide them with a really wide range of different leaves from different trees, individual trees and different species to keep them healthy. And that's what makes them one of the most expensive animals to keep in a zoo outside of Australia.
Wow. And, this other thing that I don't know, is it because of human intervention, or is it a zoonotic thing that went the other direction, or is it not zoonotic at all? But these STIs, these sexually transmitted infections, and they're ones that are familiar to us, like chlamydia. Mm-hmm. Is it the same chlamydia?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We've always assumed that the chlamydia koalas have is the same way that sheep have, and that sheep are transmitters of, and that koalas may have got that from sheep, that when sheep arrived in Australia. There's some debate about that at the moment. Genetic studies going on saying that there's also there's many different varieties of chlamydia, so it's possibly that there is a native variety as well. So that's sort of ongoing research. The other disease that they suffer from is a koala AIDS, so a retrovirus that causes an AIDS-like disease, which of course exacerbates chlamydia as well. So it makes that worse for them. And retroviruses have certainly always been present in koala populations for a long time, but they seems to be a particularly virulent form spreading from the north down through the koala population, which is having a really major impact. So, and I guess the thing we have to recognize is that those sorts of diseases typically affect populations that are under stress already. So if we have a population that's suffering from stress through habitat change, then those diseases will likely become worse. So we've got to be careful about whether we attribute that as a symptom or a cause of the problem. It's notable that the southern koala populations are doing much better. They're quite strong, and they're not having the problems that the northern populations are. But they typically have been chlamydias absent in some of those populations. And I know the ones in the Adelaide Hills where I live, where they're very, very abundant, are starting to show signs of chlamydia, but they don't seem to manifest the same symptoms. So they seem to be able to carry the chlamydia without it causing them particular problems, whereas it's a massively debilitating and painful disease in other populations. So it's a complicated issue.
Yeah. Is it treatable? Like obviously retroviruses are difficult. We now have in the human population, we have PrEP, we have drugs, but they have to be taken on a very specific schedule. They're very expensive. Like I can imagine that a koala retrovirus would be much harder to take care of. But is there a way to treat the wild population of chlamydia?
Yeah, the retroviruses are difficult. And the worst thing with them is that they're not only transmitted through birth from mother to offspring, they genetically infect the baby before it's even born. So that the offspring is born with the retrovirus in their DNA. So that's a particularly terrible component. Chlamydia is treatable, but koalas, because they are adapted to eating eucalypt leaves, they're extremely good at removing toxins from their system, and they do this using their supercharged liver. So they have a liver that's got double doses of genes for removing toxins, and they remove medication from their system incredibly well. So in a human, you might take a 3-day dose of drugs to remove chlamydia. A koala, the same drugs would be 30 days. Wow.
Drugs. And how hard is it to treat a wild koala for 30 days straight?
Yeah. Fortunately, they're not too bad. They're generally okay in captivity, but in terms of temperament. But it is really difficult. So there are vaccines currently being trialed for chlamydia, because of course the other thing is that they simply get reinfected when they're released back into the wild. But there are vaccine trials going on now which seem to be successful, and that might help take some of the pressure off. But again, unless we address the root cause of the problem, which is habitat loss, increasing drought, climate change, those factors, you're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, really.
Right. And that, of course, brings me to probably sort of the most important and almost closing question of the hour, which is, what can we do? Ultimately, we're talking about systemic problems, large-scale problems that have to do with industry, that have to do with capitalism, that have to do, they're so baked into what it means to be a human being on this planet, which is to sadly, have these terrible impacts on our wild ecology. I'm curious I hate to even do this, but from an individual perspective, other than vote, other than work to try and make sure that we are making, meaningful systemic changes, what can people do?
It's a really big question, and I don't really know what the answer is. I mean, we really need to make sure that we're providing more habitat for species. Protecting our trees, I just think, is such an important thing. And, the city, Adelaide, the city I live closest to, is actually one of the few cities, it's the only city I'm aware of where koalas are actually moving into the suburbs. And that's because...
Can I say that I love Adelaide? Like, I've traveled Australia, and everybody goes to Sydney and to Melbourne, and I love them both. And, I've been to Perth and I've been to Brisbane. But when I was in Adelaide, I was like, what a charming city that everybody I talk to from the US is like, oh, I've never been there.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful.
Well, and in Adelaide, you can see koalas in the streets.
That is there you go. So cool. I love that so much. So this really is a function. I often talk to people about, like, here in the US, it's like, put a freaking bat box up in your backyard.
That's
put a hummingbird feeder on your balcony. Like, why not make sure that your trees are healthy and happy and provide habitat on your own property?
Yeah. Just providing a minimum level of tree cover. It's so easy for developers just to cut down trees and go, oh, well, just plant some new ones. But those trees are not going to be fulfilling their ecological function for another 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 years. We've got trees in our cities that are, 200 or 300 years old. You can't cut them down and think that you can replace them. You have to protect them. And we have to be improving our tree cover. We've already removed so much tree cover. We're losing species of birds that, they're just hanging on as residual species, really. They're going to start disappearing in the next few years unless we increase their habitat and increase tree cover. So we need to be doing everything we can to increase the forest and the native plants that go with the forest, and the other habitats as well. It's really got to become a big priority wherever we live, Even if you live in an apartment, at least have something growing on your balcony. Provide some habitat for something, not just yourself.
Yeah, I have milkweed on my balcony. Like literally I'm on the 4th floor in like a concrete jungle right now, and I've got milkweed on my balcony, and seasonally I've got monarchs.
Lovely.
I've got butterflies that are like hatching on my balcony. It's very cool. Like it's
amazing.
not that hard to do. Yeah. And we just have to kind of make the effort. So, this of course leads me, I always close my show with the same 2 big questions. And this of course leads me, I think pretty seamlessly into those big picture questions. And you, as somebody who obviously your most recent book is about koalas, but you've written all about natural history, all about conservation, all about science and kind of wildlife from the extinct to the extant. So I'm curious, how you might approach these final 2 questions, and just get ready because they're kind of big picture. Okay. Okay. So when you think about the future in whatever context feels relevant to you, whether it be personal, whether it be communal, familial, or, community level, country level, global, cosmic, whatever. Number 1, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night, that you're most concerned about? Maybe you're, feeling worried or even a bit pessimistic or cynical. And then on the flip side, so that we do end on a slightly more positive note, where are you finding your optimism? What are you like genuinely, authentically looking forward to?
I think the thing that keeps me awake most at night is the corrupting influence of extreme wealth on our democracies and our governments. I think that worries me, the influence of a very small number of people with a lot of money who are influencing the way our democracies run and the decisions that are being made, and the consequent terrible impacts that are being wreaked upon our environment that don't need to be there. We've got the solutions. We know how to fix these problems. We can make life better for everyone if we adopt more sustainable economic models. And we're not doing it because there are wealthy vested interests blocking that. So that's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The thing I derive most comfort from, I suppose, is the grassroots community action and the work that local communities can do to improve their local environment and the big changes they can make. So, we're seeing a revolution finally in solar energy uptake in Australia, and most of that's been driven by individual households rather than governments. So that those sort of movements, you can we only have a very small individual power. But if we all do a little bit, it makes a big difference. So we don't need everybody to do 100% of the right thing. We don't need a few people to do 100% of the right thing. We need everybody to do a little bit of the right thing. So if we all do our bit as much as we can, it might not be perfect, but I think that in the end, sheer force of numbers will go a long way to helping the situation.
Yeah. I mean, it's we often think about this need for collective action and collective impact, but I think what you just said really points to the fact that we don't even have to do it together. We should be working together for sure, but also just doing things on our own can make a huge difference when it's happening in the aggregate.
Yeah. So you can't afford to give up hope. You've got to keep trying because that's the only option we have.
I agree wholeheartedly. Well, gosh. Okay, everybody. The book is Koala, A Natural History and an Uncertain Future by Dr. Danielle Clode. Danielle, thank you so much for enlightening us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.